Mark, it's great to be here with you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time, albeit not this particular topic. But I want to start actually with just your own background, having led Ford in the past. How happy are you right now that you are not in the top seat of an auto manufacturer right now, of a car maker?
Well, I guess it's a good time to be a retired auto exec, but I have to tell you, once the automobile business gets into your blood, particularly during times of, chaos and a lot of change, there's always the urge to jump back in. It gets in your blood.
Well, if you had to go back in, at what point would you jump in? Once we have the certainty around what the tariffs will actually look like, or now to try to shape policy?
Well, I think it's always good when you jump in when things are let's say, at the most uncertain, because you have the opportunity, first off, to rally a team in a time of a lot of turbulence. And to your point, you also get a chance to hopefully influence the decisions that are being made versus just going in and dealing with the hand that you're given.
All right, we'll come back to reality in a second, but let's just stay in imagination land for one more beat here. If you were to guide the administration right now, what would you tell them would be the most prudent way for them to get to their end goal, which is to bring manufacturing back to the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, listen, there's lots of opinions on how the administration is listening to the industry. But what I would recommend, first off, I would agree with them saying, listen, I understand the need to bring manufacturing back to the United States and your administration's desire to do that in a very meaningful way. So, start off from a very positive place and agreement. But then what I would say is, listen, there's expedient ways to do this, which have unintended consequences, second and third order kind of consequences. And there's possibly some other ways where you can make the transition easier for the economy, for consumers, but still end up at the same endpoint that you want. And so what I would recommend is, first off, rather than imposing these stiff tariffs with the flick of a switch, go in and say, listen, the USMCA agreement, which is the old NAFTA agreement, is up for renegotiation in early 2026. What I would recommend is let's accelerate that. Let's agree on what those parameters are and what a new agreement would look like, trade agreement would look like. And then give us a transition period, maybe 2 or 3 years, to be able to take the actions and achieve the objectives. Because in reality, if these tariffs get imposed unilaterally as of tomorrow, it's still going to take 2 to 3 years to achieve what you want to achieve. But there could be a lot of collateral damage to the economy and consumers between now and then, versus taking a more, let's say, strategic approach and saying, yes, that's where we want to end up, but how do we minimize that impact? And I think being able to renegotiate the USMCA agreement is a great way to do that. And it has to be approved by Congress. So yes, the next administration could come in and change tariff rates. But I think that would be a very difficult position for the next administration, whether it's Democratic, let's say it's a Democratic administration, for them to campaign on, hey, we're gonna reduce tariffs and allow manufacturing jobs to go overseas. So that's the approach I would take.
And 2 to 3 years is pretty generous. I mean, we know that factories take time to build, supply chains take time to reorganize. So, I mean, just on that note, as you were talking about, what you would do to advise. Now, on the flip side, if you were leading Ford at the moment, or any of the major automakers at the moment, what would you be doing right now?
Well, first and foremost, trying to define reality for our team, which is trying to understand, okay, what are the tariffs that are going to be on the books, and what does that impact to our company, both sales-wise and financial-wise? So first off is define reality for the organization. Secondly, what I would do is then obviously communicate that externally to the market so that they understand what the impact is to the company. Thirdly, what I would be doing is, in the very short term, take appropriate marketing actions and pricing actions to anticipate, higher prices down the road. And that could include looking at our inventory and saying what incentives, let's say, would have to be reduced because we're going to see, in my view, you're going to see a lot of COVID type behavior over the next month or two where people are going to be rushing to buy pre-tariff vehicles. So if that's the case and, you want to be able to sell them, but also maximize the profitability of the company, I would take appropriate short-term incentive actions to lighten those or to maximize, as I said, the profits of the company. The fourth thing I would do is we'd have to look at, all of our product programs and plant decisions that are on the books in our business plan. And a business plan usually goes out 5 years, and understand how does the math change for vehicles or components that we were going to source outside the U.S. With the tariffs, does that change the calculus? And therefore, to be able to define that and understand, what the capital expenditures are going to be required. And then the last thing I would do is once you do that, you also have to take the next step that really understands what happens to the supply base in that regard. And what I mean by that is when, you build a plant, for example, we used to employ what's called the bullseye strategy, which we wanted suppliers within 50, 100, 150 miles, 300 miles within the plant, depending upon what component they were producing, to be able to get that to the plant with a just-in-time, strategy. And if you're deciding to change plant locations, you have to take into account what happens to the supply base. And that's a very, very big impact that nobody's really talking right now, because the suppliers are nowhere in the same financial shape, depending upon the suppliers, than the automakers are. And on top of that, their cash flow issues over the next, starting tomorrow, are going to get a lot tighter. And what I mean by that is even if you're a supplier in the U.S., let's say you're supplying a powertrain or a transmission to an automaker, you're getting a lot of your parts from overseas, whether it's Mexico, Canada, China, etc. You are going to immediately have to pay the tariffs on those parts coming through the country. So it's not like a net 60 kind of arrangement. You pay the tariffs now. That's going to put a lot of short-term financial and cash pressure on suppliers. And as an automaker, I would make sure my team is really digging into that to understand who are the suppliers that are in good shape versus who are the suppliers are not good shape, and then what do we have to do to either secure our production in the near term or change our decisions for a medium-term plant location decision.
Well, I love how thorough you were there, and I think it's really important to actually to have broken down all the layers of this. And to your point about the immediate tariffs they have to pay versus then getting paid on a net 60 or net 120, whatever. I mean, this is something that they can't get ahead of. They can't go and renegotiate their general services agreement to say, I need to get paid earlier to minimize those cash flows. If there are now suppliers who will be in trouble, what does that mean for the rest of the auto industry going forward?
Well, it's a great question. There's a lot of parallels to what happened during the Great Recession. When GM and Chrysler at the time were going bankrupt, we actually went down to Washington, D.C. to lobby for them. And a lot of people asked us, well, why are you going down to D.C. to help your competitors? And it was a pretty simple reason. The supply base. We shared many of the same suppliers, and the industry still today shares many of the same suppliers. And if the GM and Chrysler went bankrupt without support, guess what? The supply base would have went bankrupt. And then we at Ford would have went bankrupt because we couldn't get parts from our suppliers. And so when you look at the situation now, every automaker, I think, has probably a war room or an energy room or whatever you want to call it. Because this is what we did in the Great Recession, and we have all of our key suppliers up on the wall. We have a financial profile of these suppliers. You'd have to have a view of where they're sourcing their parts from, and then you have to make decisions. Are you single sourced to that supplier? Because if that supplier gets into financial difficulty and says, listen, I can't afford to get paid 60 days from now. I need almost, COD type of terms. The automakers are going to have to acquiesce for that, or their plants are going to go down. And, when a plant is not producing, it's not making money. And, that burns a lot of cash very quickly. So I think that's the approach that the industry is going to take. And there's going to also be some suppliers that maybe will be forced to merge, encouraged by the automakers. But this is a very, very big deal that, I don't think a lot of people are talking about right now because it's so critical to the automakers.
Who are the top 5 suppliers that we should be keeping an eye on and inviting on this show?
Well, I'm not privy to, the financial performance of a lot of the suppliers. I mean, you have some very big suppliers, whether it's Bosch or Magna or Lear Corporation, which produces seats and things of that nature. They're in relatively good shape. I would say most of what they call the tier 1 suppliers, which do direct business with the automakers, are probably in decent shape. It's really what they call the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, and even tier 4 suppliers, which are basically, very small businesses. But, depending upon the automaker, they may not have visibility beyond tier 2. They may not have visibility into tier 3 or tier 4 suppliers, or in some cases, they might not have visibility into some of their tier 2 suppliers that are feeding into their system. And that's where a lot of these surprises could come. And that's where a lot of the requests, the purchasing executives in each of the automakers, their phones are going to be ringing off the hook if, in fact, these tariffs go through and some suppliers get into financial difficulty.
Right. And I'm thinking about, even the luxe threads that maybe one auto manufacturer prefers in their upholstery interior. That would be like a tier 4 that you wouldn't even think of when we look at the top headline of these tariffs. Now, we know that the administration is calling this week like Liberation Day, Liberation Week, whatever you want to call it too. But I do wonder, and we know that there will be this immediate impact first. How long do you think it will take before the administration backtracks? Because we've also seen that. I know it's hard to predict, but we also know this is a negotiating tactic. We know that this is a playbook that we've seen a little bit in the past. But do you anticipate a walk back of these tariffs at all?
Well, it's interesting. I think President Trump said these tariffs are permanent. The last I looked, the only thing permanent in life are death and taxes. Tariffs, not so much. It's a little bit of a parlor game to figure out, how permanent these are. I do believe that when the administration starts to see what I would call pretty severe economic pain, that is going to get their attention, right? Because in every election, whether it's a presidential election, a midterm, or even off-year elections, it's that old saying, it's all about the economy, stupid. Mm-hmm. And, when inflation starts spiking up because a lot of, whether it's automakers or any company that's importing, whether it's their products or components for their products from overseas, I think a majority of them are going to pass that on to the consumer. So I think when the inflation spikes up, and that is going to get their attention. And then secondly, as it relates to the auto industry, when you start seeing shifts being taken off and large amounts of employees put on layoff because of lack of demand, because of either the pricing or the overall macro environment, I think that's going to get their attention.
So this is what we were kind of talking about before when you were talking about like sort of the lag time. It'll take 2 to 3 years, for example, if you want to get a factory up and running. So it sounds like, if I'm trying to read between the lines, that these tariffs will hurt the exports enough, or sales enough too, that the industry will be so hamstrung by the financial impact of that they won't actually be able to actually hire workforces. Is that an interpretation of potentially the future if these tariffs are permanent to semi-permanent?
Well, I take a little bit of a different take on that. So if they're, quote unquote permanent, but let's say, the automakers are facing a strategic decision, right? The strategic decision is, do they expand their footprint in the U.S.? If for any other reason, just to reduce risk, and as a CEO, you always have to manage risk in the company, or do they wait to a more favorable trade environment? I think a lot of companies are going to say, listen, we'll expand our footprint in the U.S. And I'm speaking about the auto industry in particular right now, because, if you look at, Tesla is in pretty good shape. Actually, Ford is in pretty good shape. They source 80% of their vehicles assembled here in the U.S. GM and Stellantis are about 55%. So, they import about 45%. They're in worse situations. And in many cases, in the case of Stellantis, importing some of their high profit heavy duty trucks from Mexico. But, I think they're going to be making that decision to say, yes, we'll move to the U.S. And when I said 2 to 3 years, that's really around, let's say, if you have excess capacity in an existing plant in the U.S.
Okay.
It's still going to take billions of dollars and time, 2+ years to move that production to that facility. If you're building a new plant, you're talking 5 years. And, the latest example is Hyundai Kia announced a plant that in 2019 that they're just ramping right now. But when you get to that future state where you're building and expanding your footprint in the U.S., then you have other costs that are going to become a problem. And what I mean by that is, as I mentioned earlier, the supply base. Mm-hmm. Who is going to pay that capital expenditures to move that supply base to these new plants or the expanded footprint in the U.S. for those suppliers that have, let's say, a lot of their footprint in Mexico or Canada or China? And then secondarily, I think you're going to have a real labor problem. And what I mean by that is these are very hard jobs in these plants. It's repetitive. It's really, really hard work. And the people that work in the plants, I give them a ton of credit because it's hard work. And I'll give you an example. When we at Ford were expanding after the Great Recession and our share really expanded, we added a lot of shifts at plants, and we would, advertise for a shift that was going on, and maybe it was 200 people. We would get like 5,000-6,000 applications. And what we found is a lot of people couldn't qualify, or those that were hired, the turnover rate we had was high because they realized, oh my gosh, this is really, really hard work. So not only you're going to have to source labor and get qualified people, but then I think the labor economics and inflation is really going to take hold because, you're competing, for these very, hard jobs in these plants with other jobs. So I think you're going to, face a labor cost issue when you get there.
I mean, this is certainly why your job was so challenging at the head of a company like Ford, but also why you said you were happy to be a retired automaker CEO at this moment, because I mean these are huge headaches that they have to manage through and think through right now. I know you said that they're probably on the phone with each other a lot, but just be honest, how many of them are calling you up right now for advice as well?
Well, I think, listen, auto executives are the auto industry is very, very resilient. If you look back literally over the last 20 years, right, whether it was the Great Recession, then COVID, then the semiconductor problem, now you have this, and you could stretch back 40 years and you can name, 6 or 7 other existential, crises for the industry. The industry always finds a way to adapt. And I think it's one of the only industries that really has that resiliency. Listen, nobody's calling me for advice. I'm just, I'm an observer of the industry now. I do a lot of investing in the auto industry. I still remain very, very interested in it. But, there's a new set of challenges for these CEOs and their management teams. And I believe, just like every other crisis, they will pull through and figure out how to deal with this.
Because, I imagine Signal groups or WhatsApp groups with you guys talking about some of this stuff, maybe sharing ideas. Let's move to the broader, just for a moment, the larger industry. You touched upon Tesla a little bit earlier. You touched upon Stellantis, all of the companies that the consumers really are either buying as a consumer of the cars or even as investors. If you look at the share price of Tesla, of even Ford this year, I mean, there's been a lot of factors driving the markets down, and for each of these companies for very different reasons. There's some speculation that Tesla may come out on top in some ways because they have more manufacturing here in the U.S. Do you see it that way?
It's very uneven in terms of the impact. And as you said, you're seeing it play out a little bit in the share prices, although it's interesting to see, Tesla share price has been hit the most, obviously, during the last number of weeks. And obviously that has a lot has to do with not only the fundamentals of the business, is their product, stale, more competition from established automakers on EVs, or, Musk's involvement in the Trump administration, lots of different factors in there. But it is going to be uneven, and I would put them into different categories, right? I use the analogy, if you go to like a Thai or an Indian restaurant and then you order something and they say, do you want mild, medium, or hot and spicy? So I would put in the mild part kind of Tesla and also Ford. But, Hope, let me just say this. Every single vehicle that's sold in the United States is going to be impacted by these tariffs, because there is not one single vehicle on this planet that is sold in the United States that doesn't have some components or parts coming from outside of the U.S. But I'd say, they're in relatively good shape, although, a caveat, some of Ford's big engines that they put in their Super Duty F-Series pickup truck, which is a big moneymaker for them, they come from either Mexico or Canada, so they're going to have to deal with that. In the medium category, I put, some of the Japanese like Toyota and Honda, who have actually some excess capacity here in the U.S. that they could gin up pretty quickly. But, they're going to be affected, but I put them in the medium category. I'd also put GM and Stellantis in what I would call medium, tending towards the hot and spicy category. And the only reason being is, in GM's case, they're importing over 1.2 million vehicles from outside of the U.S. As I mentioned, about 45% of their vehicle sales here in the U.S. last year came from overseas, whether it's Mexico or Canada, or they import a lot of their low-cost vehicles from South Korea. And in Stellantis' case, as I mentioned, some of their high-profit trucks come from outside the U.S., so those are going to get impacted. And then in what I would call the very hot and spicy category, you got the VW, which imports 80% of their vehicles into the U.S., Hyundai Kia imports about 65%, and makers like Mazda, it's probably over 90%.
This is our version of Hot Ones. I love it. I love this analogy. I think I'm going to use it in other interviews. So thank you for bringing that spice here. I know, I really do. I really, really mean that. One company that we haven't mentioned, which is totally fair, is BYD, the Chinese automaker. And I bring that up because we know that, with Tesla's EV sales falling for the first time ever last year, we know that BYD has surpassed them in that year. And now with retaliatory tariffs also on the line, coming back toward the U.S. potentially, does that give BYD even further runway to have not only an edge in the Chinese market, but elsewhere around the world?
Well, Hope, the only winner out of all this tariff talk and that's going on is the Chinese domestic automakers. And the reason I say that is because the Western automakers are going to be preoccupied with how do they manage the tariffs, what do they do with their manufacturing footprint, how do they manage the immediate term versus the medium term. They're distracted. The Chinese OEMs are just, keeping their heads down, and, their products are very good. But let's call it for what it is. When all the Western automakers went into China, we were forced by the Chinese government to have a 50-50 joint venture partner with a domestic Chinese maker. And so they learned from us. But, what took the Japanese 40 years to do and the Koreans 25 years to do, the Chinese have done it in 10 years in terms of getting up to world-class levels of innovation and manufacturing quality. In the case of BYD, again, they first off, they've all have benefited from the Chinese government support over the last, decade to 15 years. That being said, their products are very good. as I said, they're not distracted. So I think this will, they won't get distracted from their growth strategy outside of the U.S. They're big challengers. And I think the biggest issue is the automakers. It's not just about being competitive in the U.S. They have to be competitive globally. And if you think about the Western, let's use the domestic OEMs. We used to compete with in the Japanese market in the 40s and 50s when Toyota and Honda were just getting started. Then we decided to leave the market. So we weren't competing with the best at that time in the industry on cost and innovation. And we lost that edge. And now if we're not competing head on with the Chinese domestic OEMs, whether it's BYD or Geely or whoever, that's an issue because we have to be competitive around the world.
Well, I mean, it's ironic because the whole point of the tariffs, right, is to make America more competitive, at least for sure domestically. But it sounds like the consequences will have far-reaching impacts to international market share as well.
Yes, very much so. I mean, if you're not competing at the coalface, you're not upping your game to meet the competition. And, Europe, for example, the shares could change markedly, or in South America or in Southeast Asia. It's a big issue. So the automakers, the Western automakers, are going to have to keep the rallying cry that it's not only about being competitive in the U.S., it's about being competitive globally. And how do we do that? Right.
And, the couple of times I was in Europe last year, I was in BYD a lot, actually, when I was riding an Uber. So I found that to be very, very telling. Last segment of our conversation, just really quickly, need to talk about EVs and autonomous. This has been the new narrative shift for Tesla, which has then shifted the narrative for everybody else in the industry to catch up. You've been a little bit skeptical about how successful, traditional automakers can actually, the path that they can actually take and how quickly they can take that path to catch up into an EV only sort of world. Where do you see the state of traditional automakers now in their quest to become as dominant as Tesla?
Well, fundamentally, you gotta, first off, I think they've made a lot of progress, but you have some fundamental issues. First off, an automaker like Tesla is first and foremost a software and battery company who happen to now make cars and trucks. Automakers are really great at engineering and manufacturing, but they're not native, if you will, battery and software companies. And those things are really important for success with EVs. And I think what you're seeing is the initial fits and starts of the legacy automakers were not particularly successful. You're starting to see more competitive products come in the marketplace. And that's why you're seeing, Tesla's share go down, whether it's in Europe or here in the US. But it's a journey. And I think that the biggest issue that the Western or the legacy automakers need to deal with is as software becomes more and more kind of part of the value content of the vehicle, you have to have senior leaders in those automakers that know how to run software companies. And if they're all run by, kind of automotive executives, it's a little bit like trying to translate, and it's not native for them. And so I think that's why you're seeing a lot of the legacy automakers hire folks from the outside with a lot of software experience. The key is to give them very senior positions in the automakers so they can make the key calls. And it's not just the traditional auto execs making those decisions.
I think that's a really key point to bring up with the divide. And just lastly, because we know self-driving is so reliant on software, we know Tesla is trying to push into this very aggressively, promising lots of things. But even, with an Uber, for example, really trying to say that they are working on partnering with other self-driving cars makers. Is self-driving technology really the next frontier that we ought to be pushing into, that car makers should be thinking about? I mean, it just feels like we're really jumping the gun when we haven't even figured out, let's say in this year, just for example, tariffs and manufacturing here. It just feels like there's a lot on the plates of executives these days in the car sector.
Well, you're right. There's always a lot of things on the plate of the car executives, right? It's not only how do they keep their existing business competitive, how do they manage the EV transition, how do they feel about autonomy going forward, and how does that play into their businesses? I think when you look at autonomous, I think it is going to be a big part of the market. All you have to do is, take a Waymo autonomous taxi in San Francisco, for example. The technology has come a long way, and they've been able to map the whole city. I think you're going to see that grow. It's not going to be one of these markets that grow. It's like a tree that grows to the sky. I mean, it's very specific use cases in very dense urban areas. But it is going to be significant. And I think some of the automakers, as you've seen from some of the decisions, whether it's GM with their Cruise subsidiary, or Ford with their Argo subsidiary with VW, they've decided to let others kind of take the lead on that because of these other things that they, need to prioritize.
I think it's smart. I mean, I didn't mean to say that there's never enough on your plates. I just mean it just seems like an overwhelming number, given the more immediate challenges that are at stake for the sector. So, Mark, we have to leave it here for today, but I certainly would love to continue this conversation and have you back and talk more about this because there is so much more to talk about.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for the time, Hope.
Thank you.